Okay, well, good evening to everybody. I'd like to introduce an old friend and associate of mine whom I met back in, I think it was 2007.
Mm.
We were both early members of a group called the San Diego Green Business Network, which hosted monthly meetings where small businesses could get together and network for education and promotion. We'd also occasionally have a speaker, of which Dan was one of them. City of San Diego was nice enough to let us use a conference room in their environmental building for these meetings. So after that group disbanded, Dan and I have kept in touch. He moved Northern California and I moved to Fallbrook. So let me tell you a little bit about the professional side of Dan. He's the founder of Noble Bioresources Incorporated. He's an environmental market researcher, strategist, and consultant with more than 35 years of experience. He's based in California. He specializes in bioproducts, organic residuals management, and sustainable industry development. He served as executive director emeritus of the Association of Compost Producers since 2002. He helps organizations convert bioresources into economic and environmental opportunities. Dan earned BA degrees in biology and chemistry from the University of California, San Diego. He also holds MS degrees in molecular biology and education from the University of Oregon. So, what is Dan doing right now? Within his Noble Bioresources business, he is doing compost expansion consulting with water, solid waste agencies, solid waste agencies and companies. He's introducing a new biofertilizer technology. He's also doing committee work with the Association of Compost Producers on policy, healthy soil, market development committees. He's also mentoring the next generation of composters. He's also co-chair of the Compost Coalition of Sonoma County, also co-leading the Bay Delta Bio Regional Conference. So if you'd like to find out about bioresource management, you need to talk to Dan. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. Uh, it has been a while, so I really appreciate the invitation. I'll go ahead and share my screen and put on a presentation that I put together for your team here, your Fallbrook Climate Action Team. And I was fiddling around with what kind of uh, title would be useful in the presentation. And I came up with Cooling the Planet One Bioregion at a Time, because this really reflects the work, the evolution of my work as well. So I could say that our work has kind of evolved into renewable carbon management, um, and a new method that or way of doing this work that is not strictly government related or private business related, but evolving a new approach and I'll get into some of that of bioregional development. So I broke this presentation. By the way, what is the timing that you have for presentation and discussion?
Well, we usually try to have the meeting finished within an hour by 7:30.
Mhm.
So if you do your presentation for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we have Q&A for the rest.
Okay, great. Um, oh, do you have somebody that does the timing? I'm used to doing timed meetings, and it's helpful to have. Um,
I'll keep an eye on it.
okay, if you could let me know when we're 15 minutes in, which means 15 minutes left, and then 5 more minutes, that would be good. And then we can leave a half hour for discussion. How's that?
Sounds good.
Okay, I'll try to pace myself accordingly. So So I broke it into what are bioresources and bioregions. So these are new terms to many people, most people, because they're not used extensively either in regulation or in political discussions. I will focus on the law that is in place that's driving a lot of this work here in California. And I don't know if you folks have heard about it, but it's called SB 1383, the short-lived climate pollution um, regulations. Fundamentally, it's about renewing carbon rather than putting it in the renewable carbon into the landfills, basically keeping food and plants out of landfills and recycling that carbon. But the approach is beyond states and markets, and that's what I've been struggling with for the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years, actually, while I was in and running the Association of Compost Producers. So a few definitions of these evolving and new terms. Bioresources, the way I say it, it's basically anything that's living and then dies. But you need the living portion and you also need the dying portion. But chemically, it's basically water, carbon, and nutrients, because that's what life is made out of. In our industry, we kind of divide the bioresources into primary and secondary. Primary are everything that we grow and use. So food, fiber, feed, fuel. Sometimes we call it the 6 Fs. Flowers, which represents all landscapes, and then fertilizer, which is really also compost. And I'll just hit on the difference between those because my focus is more on biological fertilizers, and that's part of what I'm developing is a new category called biofertilizers, as distinct from chemical fertilizers, which of course, we've used for the last, century really. And so we'll talk about that transition a little bit. But the secondary bioresources are really all of it's generally referred to in legislation and in the industry as organic waste. Um, but there's two problems with that term. One is organic can be chemical or biological, so it doesn't distinguish, it's biological, organic, or you could call it bioorganic. And then we're trying to get away from the waste word, and because we're moving toward a sustainable, regenerative, circular economy. And I'll get into more depth about that because that's really what's holding us up here, or what's slowing us down, I guess you could say. So I'll start with just the notion of bioresources and what they are. They, of course, all exist within a watershed somewhere. And I consider water the primary bioresource, since there is no bio without water. We all, there's also no bio without air, but there are plenty of organisms that can get their oxidation from other chemicals. And of course, microbes do that regularly. And so you have what's called anaerobic respiration versus aerobic, but that I can stray into the chemistry of all of this maybe too easily. But macroscopically, we all live in in a watershed somewhere, and the bioresources are all part of that watershed, made from the water there. Um, but watersheds are actually broken up or can be grouped together in what ecologists mainly use the term ecoregions. You don't see many of this language in regulations because regulations were formed when we thought of the environment as separate from business, and and it was physical, chemical, and biological, like the three main science classes that we've all either touched in on or majored in. But an ecoregion is one or more watersheds that have shared environmental conditions. They have natural communities, which is all the plant and animal life. And then they have an ecological dynamics that usually goes along with the weather, which of course has to do with mainly water and temperature and how that interacts with the physical land. So if you just take a look at the map of California in terms of the way the bioregions are defined, I'm not going to get into what could be called a microbioregion too much, but I can just point out, like in San Diego County, where I lived, at least half of my life. I lived in La Mesa. I had a home at one time back in Hamul, and another time we had a home in Del Mar. And then before we left, 5 years between 2010 and 2015, we lived up in Cuyamaca, and you can see that that's kind of a unique bioregion for us. And I mean, you get 30 inches of rain up there per year, as opposed to 11 inches down in the near the harbor in the center of the city. By the way, can you guys see my arrow pointer? Okay, good, good, thanks. So because I will be pointing to little, sub features. But, so we have a unique bioregion. These all have names, and the names are in the numbered systems, but I'm not going to go through that kind of detail here. But I moved up to Santa Rosa because my son graduated from Sonoma State, and he didn't want to come back home. He liked the bioregion where he had moved to, and since our family had mostly passed, we decided to join him. Which is now our family, and now we have our family up here. We have a new granddaughter as of 2 years ago, and then he moved back to East Bay, which is right in this area, but some people refer to the Bay Area as its own bioregion, which it is. And in fact, the Bay Delta, I'm already slipped into the term bioregion when I was just describing ecoregion. An ecoregion is the physical and biological characteristics of a given environment. And you can see that there's no straight lines here because there's very few straight lines in watersheds anyway, and temperature. However, when you look at them relative to our political maps, a bioregion is basically an ecoregion with people and culture. And of course, the people own property differentially. And so we've created political boundaries to be part of our whole property ownership system, whether it's owned by individuals, corporations, or governments. And now there's nonprofits are owning more and more. Like we have very active land trusts up in North Bay. We have a Marin land trust, and we have a Sonoma land trust. So there's a lot more property going into nonprofit ownership in addition to all the government land. I mean, the federal government owns most of the land. So property is owned by states and individuals. And of course, there's a marketplace for the property that's non-governmental and goes on to the marketplace, but then it's moved out of the market when it goes into trusts. That's important because we're looking at the renewable economy, so we got to think economically. And it just occurred to me that I didn't add. So I was just comparing this, and if when I don't know if you're going to get a copy of the slides, but you can see how the bioregional boundaries do not correspond exactly to the political boundaries. Although, so in San Diego, you really have San Diego County, you have two bioregions, but you're part of the South Coast bioregion, which makes sense. I mean, and it moves up to the mountains. The mountains kind of go right along this boundary between the coast and the deserts. And we're all familiar with these because we love traveling around and hike. Those of you who are environmentally oriented, probably do a lot of hiking and go into various ecosystems just for relaxation and fun. And of course, the bioregions in the whole United States are themselves can correspond, and they're kind of color coded based on the characteristics of the ecoregion in terms of the temperature, water, and so forth. In fact, in that previous slide, I've forgotten how to go back. Oh, there we go. I want to go back even one more. Um, I wanted to point out that the bioregions, of course, cross country boundaries as well as state boundaries. And so you can see that the Cascadia bioregion, which is broken up into smaller ones up here, has its own thing. And they're the most advanced group of bioregions in the United States because they comprehend the US and Canada, mostly Washington and into British Columbia, but then down into, through Oregon and Northern California as well. Now that becomes important in a little bit. Why. I want to return to the laws that are actually driving what I like to call renewable carbon management. I actually borrow the name from one of my colleagues in Minnesota who named his company that. It was basically a compost company, but I'm working with him now to develop biofertilizers. Um, and this law is important because it really is the first law that made the connection between short-lived climate pollutants. This is actually an air pollution control law to draw down carbon. And so the law is that we in California should renew our carbon rather than in turning it into landfills, where it anaerobically turns into methane, which is, as you guys probably all know, is a powerful greenhouse gas, 30 times more powerful than CO2 itself, which is, the CO2 equivalent is how you measure climate change by the carbon in the atmosphere. Um, and you don't really measure wherever else it is. It's only the carbon that's in the atmosphere. But there is another powerful one, which is nitrogen, N2O. And of course, the atmosphere is 80% nitrogen, but that's N3, and it's inert until it's oxidized and brought back into creating ammonia or the amino acids, which is the way nitrogen appears in all animal and plant bodies, because it's what makes up proteins. Um, but we're, of course, exchanging oxygen and water and carbon dioxide. Uh, we don't exchange these chemicals because we don't produce it unless we're being composted, because those gases come off of any breakdown of our large chemical or chemistry, which is the organic chemistry class that I took in UCSD. The teacher, and this was 50 years ago now, he actually 55, my goodness. He didn't call his book organic chemistry. He called it the chemistry of the light elements, which are basically, hydrogen, oxygen. They're basically the elements of life, which is where the organic word comes from. But anyway, so SB 1383, and there's a link here. You can just go right to the California's organic waste reduction laws. And but it's really those laws, and we helped as a compost association get them put in place. It basically requires all cities in our state to collect organics, but prior to to collect organics in two forms. One that's edible, so the edible food recovery, the other that's not edible, which can be go into compost. And then that compost is made into various bioproducts, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then, but we all have to educate ourselves and practice with ourselves to do that. So there's a big educational and outreach component. And then like any environmental law, there's compliance and enforcement. So the laws are really the first step. because you've got to educate ourselves and each other about those laws and then move them into practice. And of course, we've been doing environmental laws for the last 50 years also, so ever since the National Environmental Protection Act, of which greenhouse gases are in there, but they're part of the EPA. And depending on who's in office, there more or less enforcement will happen. And I have real problems with the enforcement system, and that's kind of another story, but it's an important one that I'm not going to really get into here. But it really reflects where I am going in this talk, as well as where I'm going professionally and with, literally thousands, if not millions of other people globally who are involved in this movement. So the movement, I got interested in circular economy um, when I was teaching environmental studies and realized from my ecology texts that, gee, all we have to do is create a circular economy. That was when I was in my 20s. And here I am in my 70s, and we're like, okay, we're just now starting to do this seriously. Because our economy has been a take, make, use, dispose, pollute, or take, make, waste, not a 6 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, remake, and rot is kind of the word, the other R word that's used for composting. But basically, that's the renewable carbon cycle, as well as nutrients. We don't want to forget about the nitrogen and the phosphorus and potassium and the other nutrients that also get recycled through living things. Now, this model has been refined somewhat, and you'll see this slide, which I've used and borrowed from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the circular economy team. They divide it into two cycles. One is the bioresources, and the other is the georesources. Sometimes this resource economic model is referred to as the butterfly model. And a lot of people are doing work in that, but most economists, the linear aspects of a linear extractive economy follows a linear function, just like these circles are linear partially, just like the earth feels flat or linear from a very micro processing, but once you stand back, you see, like, oh no, this is really circular. So so I'll talk about the different products that we can make, but most of it is either out of nature or so forth. And I thought it was interesting that they colored these two wings, one green, one blue, and that's the color scheme that we actually have in our collection bins. The gray bins or black bins go to the landfill. That's stuff that can't be recycled economically, because technically everything can be recycled, but it really has to do with the collection system and then disaggregating the georesources to the bioresources. Now, oil is one of those strange things because it's a fossil of very old carbon, very old living things, mostly microbes, but we sometimes we call it fossils, but it's really not fossils. It's really degraded chemicals. That's what oil is. But oil is a georesource that is originally, thousands, if not millions of years ago, was a bioresource. The problem we have with these two wings is that these resources get commingled, which is one of the reasons we have two separate bins. And plastic needs to be in the georesource because it's there, but a lot of plastic gets in with the bioresource, and that's our current main problem with recycling today, is disaggregating these two resource streams. Now, going back and looking at when I've been using the term extractive versus regenerative, you can go to richandresilientliving.com and find this graph. And basically, regenerative is a mechanistic approach to managing resources. Reduction, farmers were on this end, managing livestock and plants ever since we became, agricultural cultures, 10 or more thousand years ago. But the mechanical economy that we've developed and is, based on mechanistic and a mechanism approach. it also includes reductionist thinking as opposed to holistic thinking, which, if you're going to be an ecologist or um, an environmentalist, you tend to want to think and need to think holistically. The question is, how do we get our economy to become holistic when most of us were trained and experienced in a more degenerating economy? And so that's really the work that a lot of us are doing now in this industry. And as we manage bioregions, the new economic approach, and you can go to this website on Common Pool Resources, and also a new definition of goods and services. The economists have developed, and this is in a, a paper on polycentric governance as well as a book by uh, Eleanor Ostrom, who wrote the book in 1990, and now, here it is, 20 some, 20, we're in the 2020s, and we're now really trying to implement it. She also wrote a paper in 2010 called Beyond States and Markets, uh, Common Pool Resource Management through Polycentric Governance. So there's a whole new set of lingo here, and as we try to work our way or evolve our way culturally and economically. And so, based on this simple matrix of competitive versus, rivalrous, which I don't like that word, but it's another word for competitive, versus non-rivalrous, and then excludable versus non-excludable resources. We have a whole set of natural resources that fall into this common pool resource, or this non-excludable. Things like air, which we don't really is not part of our economy except for a very small company called Air Products, which uses air for a lot of, you know, technical purposes. But, our fish stocks, our timber management, our water, our grazing lands, that's why I put that little picture up there, um, are all common pool resources. Private goods can be excludable. You can lock them away in your house, and nobody has that at it except for your varmints. Um, but basically, they're excluded from the marketplace once they're purchased in the marketplace. Um, Same with, or different with non-rivalrous club goods and so forth. And then public goods like air, which and even television and airtime and national defense is non-excludable, but they're all public goods. So these asset classes or categories, according to these economists, to the regenerative economists, are saying, no, we've got to take these into account because they're really meaningful. They really exist in nature. And how do we manage them collectively? And we do it beyond markets and states, which is this new uh, polycentric governance approach, which is really the work that me and my colleagues and other citizens in my bioregion are doing. So getting back to the carbon, since this is a lot of, the climate change folks pay a lot of attention to the carbon. We do too in the healthy soil business. But basically, when you look at it ecologically, you're really talking about how do we manage our carbon partitioning through the three main environments: the atmosphere, the biosphere, and the geosphere. But in this case, soil is really part of the biosphere because higher plants and animals can't exist without, perennials in, like grass for feed, or those of us, that we've used timber for ever since humans evolved. But if you look at the numbers, and this, you can just, all I did was just AI Google the question, how is carbon partitioned between these three? And, immediately got the answer because the knowledge is out there that we have 885 gigatons in the atmosphere. And we actually have a little more than half of that, maybe 60%, is sequestered in plants and vegetation and the few animals that exist. But the big slug of carbon actually exists today in the soils. So managing soils is about managing carbon, and one of the ways you get the carbon back in the soil, of course, is through the plants. So so managing the carbon cycle is something that we're paying very close attention to, and that's what we do when we manage our bioresources. So just a picture of some of the mental schematics of this in our industry, in the compost industry, which I've been a part of for the last 20 plus years, is the bioresources, which are the dead or dying, um, you know, primary bioresources, which come from the food and fiber, go into our waste system after we've used them and we don't need them anymore, or we don't need or they spoil, or the wood rots or whatever in our buildings. Then it becomes a feedstock, which we can then move to a manufacturing unit and to make bioproducts. And then the bioproducts, some of them are soil, and most of the ones I work with are in soil, but there are other bioproducts. So I just wanted to list those for you. Um, so I've divided them into 9 categories of value, but you can kind of group them like these four: mulch, compost, biofertilizers, and biochar pretty much are all used in the soil. So you could group those into a larger category and we do call this in statute with the California Department of Food and Ag, who does the permitting of fertilizers and compost, and now biochar. Mulch has never been controlled substance, I guess you could say. Also, with the food scraps themselves, a lot of the farmers on site use them as animal feed, but there is an animal food market, and some cities actually collect their food scraps separate from from their landscape clippings, which is what most of this is made out of. But usually, it's a combination of high carbon, high nitrogen, or high nutrient feedstocks, and that's what creates all of these products. This is usually low carbon, high nitrogen, but animal feed has a high amount of carbon, even straight animal feed like cattle fodder and oats and so forth is human food too. But then the other more geo resources that come from bioresources are electricity, biofuels themselves like ethanol, chemicals for managing the chemicals, and then product materials, of course, which we've used. One of the challenging things about our industry is that you can get paid coming or going, and depending on your business model, this is very non-traditional because we pay to dispose of our waste, and ideally we pay less to the secondary bioresource processor, like a composter, than we would pay to bury it. That's the idea. And since governments own most of the landfills, although the private sector owns quite a few of them as well, whether it's Waste Management or Public Services or EDCO, they all own landfills. There's other bioproducts producers that actually have to purchase the feedstocks, especially if it's going to be pure. So this economy is not intuitive. It's complex, and you actually have to use complexity models and system dynamics models to understand just this portion of the economy, the connection between all three. So you got to take all three together, and a lot of producers still to this day don't. They'll take maybe two, but we're working through that. The industry is getting more and more sophisticated every day. Of course, there's scale, and I'll be done here in a minute. Um, that you can go from tiny to massive centralized. And in the food, there's just a recent book out that I just learned about 2 weeks ago called Tiny Gardens Everywhere. a history of urban resilience. So this is a really excellent, I think it's a backyard or raised bed garden. It looks very productive. But then if you just want to produce tomatoes, we've moved in California and everywhere really into monocultures. California is unique because we have over 400 different kinds of crops, whereas in the Midwest, you really only have four crops, four main crops, other than a few vegetable crops, but not commercial. So we bring in $60 billion a year on all of our crops, most of which are in the Central Valley. San Diego County is mostly small plot farmers or what are now being called urban farmers if they try to do it productively and go to urban farms. Same is true with non-food crops. So we all know about and have managed ourselves if we own property, um, small managed landscapes. But in California, we have huge, um, what are called natural and working lands, and those are also referred to as nature-based solutions for global warming because you can massively sequester carbon in these landscapes, and particularly grass because it's high growing. And there's a big movement up here where we have a lot of grazing lands. And we actually have grazing lands in San Diego up in the Warner Springs grazing land. That's the biggest pasture land that we still have down there. But so managing these lands is critically important, but returning the dead plants and animals to the soil, small composters, you can either do it in containers or in bins. You sometimes want it covered depending on how much rainfall you get so that they don't get too wet. Otherwise, you have to add water and vice versa. The large scale, this is the world that the commercial compost and municipal compost industry lives in. And most of you may know about that. This is actually a picture of a project that I did in Bakersfield, where we were experimenting with what we call covered aerated static piles. In this case, we used finished compost to cover the piles, but we ran the blowers because it's aerated. We had active blowers here, and we actually had solar powered and we had battery packs so that the blowers could run all night. And so they were keen to that. So one little power pack could run this blower. So in this case, the air blows up and goes through a moistened top cover. So that captures all of the evolved gases from the anaerobic parts of the pile. Because if it's aerobic, they'll all get oxidized, and that's the point of compost. They also reach high temperatures, which makes the process go much faster. So that's the technology. And that's the end of my current presentation. Questions?
Well, that was right on time, Dan.
Okay, good.
Why don't you, yeah, there you go. So I don't see any questions in the chat room. Is anybody in the audience like to raise their hand or chime in a question for Dan?
I have a question for you guys. How does this relate to your other presenters and presentations? Have you had a presentation like this about renewable carbon management and um, bioregions and bioresource management? And I didn't go into any depth about how difficult this is and how it changes the economy, we're really actively trying to change our economic way of thinking.
Well, I'll comment about that. We generally, about once a year or maybe less, will have a presenter from EDCO to talk about recycling, about their
Okay.
recycling. And people always have tons of questions about what can be recycled and how can we recycle things.
Yes.
And one thing that you and he have in common, and so it must be right, he said the same thing. The biggest pollutant is plastic
Right.
people putting plastic in the compost, in the green compost bins. But they don't really go into it as much as do from a macroeconomic standpoint. We also have had some other speakers talk about composting.
Yeah,
The Solana Center has
right.
given us some presentations about composting.
Yeah, they're a premier center, and in fact, their former executive director, um, Diane Hazard, is now the executive director of the National Compost Research and Education Foundation. So San Diego's been ahead of the curve on compost facilities down there because City of San Diego is in the composting business. But you have one of the few on-farm composters up near where I think most of you live in North County, um, in San Pasqual Valley soils. And they're the last remaining dairy farm in the whole county.
Hmm.
We used to have 200 dairies in San Diego. Now we have one. So most of the milk products are produced in the Central Valley. We have some organic dairies up here in North Bay. Um, but but that's the thing, is to tune the farming and the organics management to the local bioregion, because compost gets really expensive if you have to haul it any distance. In fact, if you go over 50 or 60 miles, you're going to start losing money. You're not going to make any money on it.
Hmm.
So what we're doing in the compost industry now is working with community composters. There's actually a separate association which started maybe 5 years ago, called the California um, um, Community Compost Alliance, or no, the Community Composters Alliance of California. Anyway, CCAC.org is their URL. And the new executive director uh, of our state association, the Association of Compost Producers, is also on their board. So we're trying to collaborate much more between the farmers, the community composters, and then the macro, what we call municipal or contract composters. So that's the beauty of bioresources in that scale. All of us have to return to the soil, otherwise we go to a landfill. And most of us don't want to go to a landfill ourselves. The
I have a
plastic is, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. I have a compost bin at the side of my house, and
Uh-huh.
the county subsidized it for me,
Oh,
so it wasn't too expensive.
yeah.
And I throw everything into the compost bin. I've owned the property for 6 years and I have
Mhm.
not ever succeeded in filling it up. That is, I fill it and then it just rots down to the point, and I just keep throwing things. I'm a terrible composter. I don't add water. I don't fuss with it. I just throw orange peels and food scraps in it.
Yeah,
Um, and the thing is that the program for the county has little canisters that you're supposed to put under your kitchen sink,
yeah,
and I'm just looking at that and thinking, boy, they're always going to be smelly, and really, I take the compost bowl out probably not as often as I should, but if it in 2 or 3 days it gets fruit flies and whatever, and if I had to like fill one of these silly canisters, and wait for a week for it to I don't know, and then the green bin would get gloppy food scraps,
yeah.
like how, do people actually put their little canisters, the contents, into their green bins? And I mean, this is actually working.
We use
Not working well.
compostable bags
It all
and
gets
we
back into
use
logistics, as you're pointing to here, and scale. I I probably produce about as much compost as you do, and I am a compostable material, I guess is the way to say it, because it's not compost until it is composted. Um, but the little bins that we have under the sink, or I have one that I got from Costco, and um, I actually put it in a paper bag, and there's other people that are selling cellulose-based bins that are themselves compostable, and that all works well. Um, but I have a big green bin. I have landscape clippings. It sounds like you don't have many landscape clippings, or do you live in an apartment, or do you have landscape?
I have a half an acre that Diane Kennedy designed for me before she left town. So
Oh
it's a
my.
food forest and it's a permaculture landscape. And I basically I use all the green clippings as compost, um, except for the weeds and these things with seeds in them because I don't have enough heat in my compost
Correct.
to kill that stuff. So I just want it in the green bin and let someone else compost it at heat. Gay, did you comment about how whether you were using your compost, your
I
little compost?
do, and I use the little biodegradable bags and then just put them in my green waste. And we don't have a problem with flies or odor or anything within a week.
Yeah, that's kind of what the green bin was designed for, was to mix your food scraps with, but
Right.
most people who rent, I rent, but I'm in a duplex and and we have a lot of deciduous trees right outside. And so I have I fill up my bins with leaves, during the fall, but that's it. Like right now, maybe there's a little bit of hedge trimmings, things like that. So as we all know, there's that cycle to producing the organic waste, and our industry feels that too. The fact that we wanted to mix food scraps with it, I was all for just letting the food scraps go down the garbage disposal because they end up at the wastewater treatment plant. And that's what I'm mostly dealing with is taking the nutrients out of the water and putting them into a compost feedstock, which is what wastewater treatment plants do. That's what I'm working on. But it's higher nitrogen because of the food scraps and they're more concentrated. So we're
We're
still,
septic here, so I try to limit
that makes
what I,
good
what I
sense. Yeah,
put.
you don't want to put all that stuff in your
Yeah,
septic
I
tank.
don't do that.
So, but you do have solid waste collection.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, when I'm trying to think now. Yeah, when we were living up on 2 acres in Cuyamaca, we had most of the grass we just weed whacked and let that go right back into the ground. But we had a lot of leaf mold because I was clearing brush all the time and then whacking that up. And that all, makes good compost feedstock. So you got to balance your compost load to whatever your feedstocks are. And when you're a homeowner in a residential, suburban lifestyle, it's really variable. You know, Apartment houses in the city of San Francisco is a prime example. They were one of the first cities to actually do a lot of organic recycling. And they still have major problems with their apartment buildings, and multiple family homes because that food scraps is messy to have to deal with.
Yeah, it's hard. I
Let's
mean,
face it.
really, I'm just one person and I'm kind of a detailed nerd. So
Yeah,
I separate things carefully, but it's hard. It's hard dealing with packaging and I got a sandwich the other day which was in a nice cardboard box, but it had a cellophane window and I couldn't figure out, do I need to rip this? The cellophane was really glued down. I couldn't
yeah.
get it separated. And so I wasn't sure if I should throw it in the
Well,
compost or throw it
cellophane,
in
believe it or not, if it's actually cellophane and not plastic, most people confuse it with plastic, which is natural. But cellophane is, as the name kind of alludes to, is made from cellulose.
right. But
And
I think that it was probably just plastic. It wasn't labeled, and
yeah,
I had no idea how to, should I show it, throw it in the recycler or put it in the green bin as food contaminated paper, or I mean, it was
you're
just
absolutely right. I mean, this is the problem with our system because we've simplified it more than what nature simplifies it. We've we've divided it into three categories, and nature doesn't divide things into three categories. And because plastic is a new chemical for nature, it's designed to not be biodegradable. But our chemical industry that we've been working with for decades has developed biodegradable plastics as a service to the customer. But my wife hates using them, and we had for a short time, a requirement to use those bags. Even the grocery stores, they're vegetable bags, and that was hard because you put that stuff in your fridge, and the vegetable bag starts to deteriorate in your vegetable drawer. So, we're still in early days here. We're still trying to invent our way to this imagined future that we all can see is there, but it's materials management 101, but actually this is more like 501.
Well, Dan, isn't a large part of the problem of that just simply economics? That if this was something that was producing an income stream that some industries found attractive, they'd be jumping on it like crazy. Wouldn't that be the case?
Yeah, and that's the problem, is that our economic system rewards um, scale, and it rewards the use of landfills. The whole packaging industry is based on landfills. And the old packaging industry came in after World War II. I mean, we used to collect organics in a garbage pail in San Diego, and that garbage went out to the local hog farms. That's the way we did it before packaged and prepared foods. So I'm hooked on prepared foods too. I love natural foods, and we do have a lot of, that. But so it is a cultural shift, because we already shifted from little packaged goods with maybe, tin cans or glass jars, which are ultimately recyclable as a georesource. But plastic is much lighter, it saves on transportation costs, yada, yada. I mean, all the reasons for that. So we've developed a chemical-based economy, which is where the oil industry is from, but they also produce all of our fuels. One of the challenges of our environmental laws is that we didn't include energy in our laws. We only included water, um, uh, air, water, and gas. If you look at the three main departments of any EPA group in our country, you have air regulations, water regulations, and solid waste regulations. You do not have energy or materials regulations except at the end of use. And so that means we have to work with the producers. And in fact, there's new associations. These are all nonprofit groups which make money from, donations, basically. And we haven't really embedded them in the economy yet. That's what the polycentric governance is trying to do, is really make the nonprofits part of the economy. But the nonprofits, like to your point, Bill, doesn't make investors profit. So who invests in the regenerative economy?
If we could
And
just charge the grocery stores only provide paper bags now, but everybody gets them because they cost only a dime or 15 cents. And so, people filter through, and instead of getting plastic bags, they get paper bags now. And
yeah,
if we charge $5 a bag, then people would start bring reusable bags. I mean, really,
Always forget.
yeah,
yeah.
I had to get into, my wife and I, because I'm a recycling nerd, I did get into the reusable bag business. So we always carry reusable bags. We have two cars, and in both cars, and sometimes but we always bring in bags. And I notice other customers, we're maybe one out of 100 people that actually brings in reusable bags. Um,
Well,
Paper bags are okay, by the way. They're very compostable. So one of the things you can do is double paper bag your food scraps and just put it in the green bin. I do that all the time. I just wrap up my food scraps, put them in the green bin. And that's the only thing that's in the green bin a lot of the time. But they pick it up and it goes right in with the other green material and it gets composted. And as long as you don't have plastic in there, you're good to go. That's the new habit that I'm in.
Dan, I want to jump in because we do have a question in the chat, which
Yeah.
is how valuable is composting to eliminating carbon?
The composting, well, the main thing and the reason that we have SB 1383 is that in the landfills are anaerobic. You can't, and they do produce methane with all that carbon. And so we implemented landfill laws 10 or 20 years ago that capture as much of that methane as we can, and then that methane can be turned into energy because it's a fuel, obviously. You'd much rather do that because even the carbon in the compost, half of that carbon goes back into the atmosphere straight away. So the other half is in large molecules, like the wood chips, large materials. That goes in and helps conserve water in the soil, and it also helps to aerate the soil. So it provides a home and an existence for the microbes. So really what you're doing when you're building healthy soil with compost is building a healthy microbiome. It's the microbiome that feeds the plants ultimately, and ideally you want to feed the bigger plants, and it's their roots that get embedded way down deep that create that extra carbon sequestration. And that carbon sequestration has been demonstrated to be on the order of centuries, not, months or years. So there's a lot of that carbon that just gets recycled from the atmosphere to the plants. But really what we're going for is the carbon sequestration in the soils, using all of the energy, solar energy in the plants to put carbon deeper into the soil. And farmers are getting with that program. It means you manage your nutrients really differently because we've used chemical nutrients and we burned out a lot of the carbon from the soils nationwide. So now we're needing to put the carbon back in the soils, which brings the water, makes the plants grow deeper roots, puts more oxygen, and that's all good. That's the goal, but it's long term. It means we change our cropping practices. Now, the USDA and the CDFA, the California Department of Food and Ag, are very much promoting this now. And they're not controlled by the chemical industry, but the farmers who are making the switch used to be the organic movement. Now they call it regenerative ag. And so all of us with the carbon that we manage, the carbon and nutrients and water that each of us manages, we can manage at that scale. But at the larger scale, the large landscapes, the farms, the natural and working lands, that all has to be publicly managed. Again, like to your point, Bill, that's not profitable in the same way that, for example, now AI is profitable, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah. Well, but likewise too, those kind of long-term investments ultimately probably will make them more money because there'll be less fertilizers to buy. Their
yeah,
crops will be more plentiful, more healthy, less or more pest resistant, et cetera, et cetera. So if they can look at the long term versus the short term, then ultimately they can make more money off it.
they can, and the new generation of farmers, the farmers' kids, they exist. I can't believe how many women farmers there are now of the next generation.
That's a really good thing. Joy's got her hand up for a
Well, I
quick.
Yeah.
just have a real quick question. I was wondering, are there any resources in San Diego County that we can point local farmers to help them regenerate their soil?
Yes, and that's an active job of Compost Association. And City of San Diego is now really getting with that program. Um, also working more closely, and this is something we've been doing for the last number of years, is work with the resource conservation districts, because they are now getting with that program as well. There's another group that I know operates in San Diego called Zero Foodprint. And what they do is they work with restaurants to, on the restaurant bill, if you're with that program, they charge another 1% above on your tab, and the restaurant donates that money through Zero Foodprint, which they then subsidize the farmers to buy compost. So the thing about a circular economy is that it only grows as fast as you run materials through the economy. The thing about the linear economy, which was really based on the colonial model of you go into a country, plant a flag on the sand and say, okay, now the king owns all of this. So we own the people and we own all the property. And so that's not the way the US was run, but in the initial colonial days, that's the way it was. And so that's a very extractive economy. It made Britain very wealthy. And if you look at where all the points of extraction, mining is the ultimate extractive economy, but we're not going to run out of rocks anytime soon. There are the precious metals or the metals that, and people try to corner the market on those resources. The beauty of biology and farming is that, and natural and working lands and growing wood and all of that, is that it is regenerative, hence the name regenerative economy. Rocks regenerate, but on a geologic time scale, just like stars regenerate on a universal time scale. Fortunately, plants and animals regenerate on a biological human scale.
Something a little shorter.
Yeah, and the water too. The water cycle is regenerating all the time because it's, how that works. So it's working with the cycles, which means we transform our economy, which is multi-generational. I've been working on this ever since I was a teenager. So, and I feel like we're finally making headway, but we're not to the place where we can draw down sufficient carbon. We got to do both. Reduce the amount of carbon we're producing and sequester everything and more than what we're producing so that we get to a point of drawdown. This is one main method, which is use the biology.
Well, thank you for that. I think we're going to all leave here a little bit smarter tonight.
I always do the big picture, but I can go down technical if you want to. But
Well,
some other time.
Smarter and bewildered a bit too.
Yeah, it's overwhelming for most of us.
Well, bless your heart for all that you've done and are continuing to do. And I love the idea of the mentoring that you're doing, because that's going to be so, so important.
Oh, it is critical. I mean, most of my generation anyway has either died or retired.
Right.
So that's a big part. That's what the associations are for. That's part of nonprofit governance. Because you can still make money in a nonprofit. You got to profit a little bit, but you don't have to pay taxes on it. That's the key. And so big portion of this economy is a nonprofit economy. I say it's not like the extractive economy where the goal is to make a killing. Our goal is to make a living. So
nice phrase. You
yeah.
You should coin that. So.
Well, I just spread it around so that other people use it and make that distinction between extractive and, accumulating more wealth than you really need. Then it's just all about power.
Right.
Of controlling others.
Okay. Well, we went a little bit over time, but nobody's counting. So
okay. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, everyone, have a good evening.
Thanks. And continue back to your vacation, Bill.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thanks.
Take care.